Well, good evening. That was pretty lame. Good evening. Tried it one last time. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Jay Bruce. I have the privilege of being a professor of philosophy here at John Brown University, as well as the director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing. And it's my privilege to introduce tonight's Barnett Lecture to you. The Ray and Laureen Barnett Civic Leadership Series, established in 2016, is funded by an endowment given by the family, as well as donations for more than 20 different individuals and organizations. The series, which brings a speaker to JBU each academic year, focuses on Christian leadership and addresses the intersection of faith and public service. Past speakers include Professor Wilfred McClay, Chief Judge Levinsky Smith, Alveda C. King, former Governor Mike Huckabee, and current Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. Ray and Laureen Barnett celebrated 74 years of marriage in 2014 and were the parents of 7 children. Born and raised in Northwest Arkansas, they served actively in the Siloam Springs community for nearly 60 years. They supported the political system, helping run local elections, and they were active member of their local parties, committees, and clubs. Ray was appointed during Governor Mike Huckabee's term to serve on 2 state commissions, the Volunteerism Board and the Human Services Board. And Ray and Laureen also recruited over 300 junior year boys and girls from the Siloam Springs area to serve in Boys and Girls State. Ray was a World War II veteran and past commander of the local American Legion, and he served as the Arkansas Legion Department Chaplain for the state of Arkansas. Laureen was a long-standing member of the Women's Auxiliary and worked tirelessly to promote an awareness of Veterans Day. Ray pastored and preached at many churches in the area with his wife at his side, and once they retired from ministry, they were active in their local church. Their home was always a place of warmth and love, and over dinner this evening, a member of the Barnett family reminded me of how they were not respecters of persons in the best possible way. If you were rich, if you were poor, if you were well-known or ignored, they cared for you. Ray went to be with the Lord on February 5th, 2015, and his wife followed June 8th, 2020. But their presence is still, their positive impact continues. And part of the way that it continues is in tonight's lecture, Faith Enough to Serve. That is the lecture that will be delivered tonight by Judge John K. Bush. Judge Bush is a son of Arkansas. He was born in Hot Springs, but like me, he did not have the privilege of receiving a university education in the natural state. Instead, he went to this place called Vanderbilt, graduating summa cum laude, and then to another place called Harvard Law School, where he was the editor of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. John Bush was nominated to the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit on May 8, 2017, and assumed office on July 21st of that year. When he was nominated, Judge Bush was a partner in the law firm of Bingham, Greenbaum, Dole. I read that on the internet, so it must be true. And approximately 70% of his practice involved cases at the federal level. And even while working hard to rise in the ranks of a law firm, John Bush still found time to write. For example, he contributed a book chapter on Governor Morris for the book America's Forgotten Founders, co-edited by Gary Gregg and Mark David Hall. And Mark Hall is a friend and known to JBU because he's come and lectured here several times, and he says hello, by the way. So Judge Bush is joined tonight by his wife, Bridget. And before we welcome Judge Bush, I think JBU's President Chip Pollard wants to make some brief remarks. So I'll turn it over to Chip.
Sorry for a long introduction, but I just needed to do it today. About 35 years ago, Carrie and I were leading something called the Harvard Law School Christian Fellowship. And it was in our second year there. And all of a sudden, John Bush showed up as a first-year student. And it is one of the great joys of the Christian life, the way God brings you back together. And so tonight is a night that I really am looking forward to. He grew up in Arkansas. I grew up in Chicago. We both met at Harvard. He never came back to Arkansas. I spent the last 20 years of my life in Arkansas. But as we talked this afternoon, it really felt like God's hand has been both of our lives in ways that have been really flourishing for us and also for the work we've given to do. So it's with great joy that I ask you to give a warm JV welcome to Judge John Bush.
So I promised Chip I would tell no stories on him if he wouldn't tell any stories on me. Thanks for honoring your side of the compact. I want to just say how it's such a privilege to be here, and your university is known throughout the country. It's you're growing in stature, and when I met Jay at a conference I believe it was last year, we were at a conference together. And I found out you were here, and I thought, wow, this would be a wonderful opportunity to come here. I said, do you know somebody named Chip Pollard? And he said he did. No. So I'm just so glad this worked out tonight. And I wanted to really express my thanks to the Barnett family for all that you are doing for this school and what you've done, and for your parents. What an amazing witness and testimony they continue to be through the legacy that you all have established here. So I wanted to just go back a little bit. As Chip said, we met at Harvard Law School, which is not exactly always a place where you expect a lot of folks that maybe would go to Christian fellowship. But we had a really good group there the time we were there, and you were very welcoming to me. But who would have thought, as you pointed out, a guy from Arkansas would end up in Kentucky on the Sixth Circuit, and you're from Illinois, and we'd end up in Arkansas. So, God, guides us on our paths in ways that we can't always explain of where we're going to be. But as we go through this journey, faith guides us, and our faith may falter at times, but God never gives up on us. And I learned in looking through the history of John Brown University that there was a professor, I believe in the 1920s, who wrote the hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness." And I thought that was really amazing because it was a wonderful hymn, and it really is something that is a bedrock for all of us in our Christian journey. When I was preparing for this talk tonight, I must admit I had more trepidation than I normally have when I go to give a talk, because normally you're in front of you're giving a secular talk. I'm not a preacher, but I must say, as I was going through, this to figure out what I would say and what my basis was, I started looking, of course, in the Bible, thinking I would get some inspiration. I was asking, what book? Judges? And I also thought the title could be The Burning Bush. And I'm glad you all laugh at my jokes. Actually, you find when you get on the bench how people suddenly find you're more funny than you were before you were on the bench when you told a joke. So I appreciate that we have some people willing to indulge me tonight. But what I tried to do is, in thinking about what I was going to say tonight, I was wanting to focus all this under a simple title. And I think Jay was saying my original title was Faith Enough to Serve, and I think it got spruced up to be just Faith to Serve. But essentially, what I'm going to try to do is define what faith is for me as a federal judge. And first, I want to talk about what the role of a judge is. Not someone who has any particular job, who has my particular job, but actually any judge. And in fact, my thoughts, I think, could pertain to any person in the workplace. I serve on a federal court of appeals, and for those of you who aren't as well versed on how we're organized, there are courts of appeals for each section of the country. This part of the country is the 8th Circuit. I serve on the 6th Circuit, and so we hear the appeals from the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan. So we're that swath of country over there. But anyway, my remarks tonight won't pertain in particular to that job, but it's going to talk about how a Christian could or implement your faith in the context of whatever job you're doing, whether it be a federal judge or any job. Secondly, my typical speeches before law students and lawyer groups concern jurisprudence, on how judges decide cases. And so we talk about things like textualism, and I found out today some of your students are very well aware of textualism, and so I'm pleased to know that. But we talk about that, we talk about originalism, we talk about living constitutionalism, a lot of isms. But tonight I'm not going to talk about something tied to a particular judicial philosophy, because to be a Christian, you don't have to be an originalist or a living constitutionalist. And also, I do not claim that Christianity has a monopoly on good judges. In fact, not all judges who are Christians, believe it or not, are necessarily good judges. But I believe that the Christian principles I'm going to discuss are relevant to anyone, regardless of who would be interested in the proper role of a judge, regardless of whether he or she is a Christian. And finally, I do not claim to be an authoritative guide to Christianity or the role of religion in a functioning society. You may have some differing views with me on some of the things I have to say. I'm by no means a perfect person, and I will admit I've made mistakes in things I've written and spoken and in my actions. There are things I wish I could do over. I am a sinner, but I do count myself a follower of Christ. So why do I say I'm a Christian? Well, I'll give you some of my background, and it's been alluded to already. I was born into a Christian family. I grew up a Southern Baptist here in Arkansas. And I used to go to summer camp, actually near here, at the Camp Siloam. So we had this song, "Oh, next to my home, I love you, Siloam." So anyway, I wasn't asked to be in the heavenly choir, but based on that. But yeah, so Siloam has always had a warm place in my heart because we would come here every summer, and it was just a lovely, beautiful area, and it's great to be here. And then my mother's family comes from a place in Benton County near Gravette, actually between Hiawassee and Gravette. And they were members of the Mount Pleasant Missionary Baptist Church, which I'm pleased to say is still there. Everything else around, I think, has been torn down. But I do remember going to services there and hearing, we had these shaped notes, and you'd sing the old hymns there. And my grandmother played the piano, so that had a big influence on me growing up. But my mom was really the source of my faith inspiration growing up, and she witnessed to me when I was 7. I was quite young, but I made a profession of faith actually on Easter Sunday almost 50 years ago in 1972. So this is a big year for me as a Christian. So when you join the Baptist church, you probably know you walk down the aisle and you ask to be baptized. And I was the only one who walked down the aisle at the end of that service. But every Easter, my mom reminds me of that commitment that I made. And it's a commitment I take seriously. So it's as simple as that to become a Christian and to make the decision publicly known. And I do not believe salvation can be lost. But I also believe, as the Bible says, that Christians are known by our love and our works, called the fruits of the Spirit. A human's work comes not at the point of salvation. That's the easy part, for God does the heavy lifting at that part. The work comes after you walk down the aisle and profess your faith. The work comes, as they say, in walking the talk. Now, my wife, Bridget, who's here, who we met in law school, she also grew up in the Christian faith. Her family was Roman Catholic. And we were fortunate to find an understanding priest to marry us. And his advice was simple. Our family should attend church together, and we should find a church home where we were both comfortable. And that's something we really took seriously. We have three boys, and I would say a lot of our decisions that we've made in our marriage, in our family, has been centered on maintaining our family and for our family, and remaining faithful in our church. So we actually ended up in a denomination between Baptists and Catholics. We ended up as Episcopalians. So for what it's worth, that's where we are. And I'm not here to debate theological differences between Baptists, Catholics, Presbyterians, or Episcopalians, or whatever. But I do want to talk about beliefs that Christians have in common. And one thing you learn when you go to a place like Harvard Law School is that differences between denominations aren't that significant when you're in an environment where most people do not profess to be Christians. So one thing I really noticed at Christian Fellowship is how you really come together as a group in that kind of an environment. And we don't really, I didn't even know what denomination most people were in the group, but we all knew we were Christians. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that and also kind of talk about my background as growing up. I didn't have any personal contact with judges growing up, which I think was a good thing. I was the first person in my family to go to law school, but having no lawyers in the family left me ignorant, really, of what judges do. We would watch television shows. You know, Judge Wapner was big back then. I don't know how many people remember him. And then Perry Mason, Matlock, we had those to guide us. But and then in church we would read stories about judges, and then we were learning about the kings of Israel who were judges, and then of course the famous story of Solomon, who had to judge the case of the two women who each claimed to be a mother of the baby. And we read about the Ten Commandments and the other laws of the Old Testament. But the judges of the Old Testament seem far removed from the judges of today. And the New Testament message I received, that while we should honor God's law, all of us will fall short in complying with it. For God's forgiveness of our sins is our only salvation. God is our judge, and Christ essentially is our lawyer. So as 1 John chapter 2 reminds us, but if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours alone, but also for the sins of the whole world. And there's also that sometimes neglected verse after John 3:16, which is John 3:17, that says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Now, as a federal judge, I'm by no means a god, nor am I like the judges of the Old Testament who had virtually unlimited power to do justice. I cannot dispense remedies like Solomon's order to split the baby in two in order to discern the true mother's identity. I'm a judge with limited powers. I'm limited by the jurisdiction prescribed by the Constitution and Congress, and I'm bound by the oath I took to uphold the Constitution and other laws of the United States. Now, state judges have similar limitations under state law and responsibilities to enforce that law consistent with state and federal constitutional guarantees. So how does a Christian judge go about fulfilling these responsibilities? I submit the answer is similar for any Christian in performing secular work, whether in legal field or not. First and foremost, prayer is important. I make it a practice to pray before I go on the bench. And at the suggestion of my pastor, I've tried more recently to pray while working on opinions. Mostly I pray for guidance and wisdom. Now, mind you, I am not deciding cases based on divine revelation. I am deciding based on the briefs and arguments of the parties and the relevant law. But I do believe that God has his hand on what we do in the courts, just as he is involved in everyone's work. Prayer is important not just for ourselves, but for others. I'm not always good at doing this, but I do try to pray for my colleagues in doing their work as well. And that can be hard sometimes when you have someone who doesn't always see the law the same way you do. I'm not praying to persuade them or to forgive them. The forgiveness part is a joke, by the way. But I am praying because that is what we are commanded to do. And prayer, of course, is also important for litigants. I'll give you an example of how prayer, I think, had an impact on a case the first year I was on the bench. And I'll just give you what happened. It concerned a woman named Maribel Trujillo Diaz, who had come to the United States from Mexico and had been deported. She sought asylum in this country, and she claimed her family was subject to kidnapping and other mistreatment by a Mexican gang that was tolerated by local Mexican authorities. I expressed no opinion on the merits of her case. However, in the opinion my court issued, we held that the Board of Immigration Appeals had failed to consider an affidavit submitted by her father that Ms. Trujillo Diaz claimed was documentation of her family's torture. So we sent the case back for further consideration by immigration officials. So why does this case stand out? Well, it was one of my first opinions. In fact, I had two opinions that came out the same day. One got castigated by media left and right. This one, maybe not so much. But one of my clerks checked the news to just see if there was any mention of this case, because we didn't know that it was that significant. And it turned out, it had been followed by the national media, including a feature story by the Washington Post, of all things. And it turns out that Ms. Trujillo-Diaz was active in the Catholic Diocese in Cincinnati, and there had been well-publicized prayer vigils on her behalf. Now, I didn't know this at all, but after our opinion came out, she was allowed to return from Mexico to be reunited with her family in Cincinnati while her asylum petition was being reconsidered by immigration officials. So as I said, I wasn't giving any weight to how it was portrayed in the media, but it kind of drove home to me the fact that, there are things I'm doing that people are praying for me, or they're praying for our court, and you just don't know how it's going to, what will happen as a result. And I have individuals who will tell me at various points, and I'm just amazed. They'll just say, John, I've been praying for you, and just to have that kind of, impact on me, to know that there are people out there that can have an impact. They may never be in our court, but just to know that they're there remembering us, I think it's amazing, and it confirmed to me the power of prayer for the work I do. God works his plan through many people, Christians and non-Christians alike. One of the traditions we have in the Episcopal Church is our practice of praying every Sunday for persons in positions of government service, regardless of their party. So on Sundays, we'll say a prayer for all who work for justice, freedom, and peace. Certainly, I think those prayers are needed today. As for praying for litigants and cases, I do not think there is anything wrong with prayer for a particular outcome, but we should always bear in mind the Lord's Prayer, not that things should go the way we believe they should go, but thy will be done. Now, one thing I will not discuss today, is the appropriateness of prayer in public places. That is an issue that has been before my court and likely will be again. But no one argues that private prayer is unconstitutional. We can talk privately with God anywhere, and I do believe he hears what we say and responds in ways consistent with his will through the people and events of our everyday lives. Now, besides prayer, another important part of the judge's role, I believe, is to listen. And it comes from what Jesus said was the second greatest commandment of all, to treat others as you would yourself want to be treated. Everyone is entitled to be heard. And when we honor others in conversation by doing for them what we would like others to do for us, to listen. One of the so-called seven laws of Noah, which are to apply to all people regardless of religion, is the creation and maintenance of courts of justice. There is a fundamental human need to be heard in such courts for redress of wrongs committed by other humans. As we read in the 13th chapter of Romans, justice finds its root in love. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. As a judge, I am to pay attention to each person before me without bias and without regard to the station of the litigant. Reminds me of the example of your parents, of not having a particular way you treat people by their station in life. And that's what we as judges are to do also. Our oath says that we are to administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. I am to approach each case with an open mind and a willingness to be persuaded by either side based on the law and facts. And I am to conduct myself in a spirit of love. As Paul wrote in his first letter to the Corinthians, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Bridget and I experienced the love from a federal judge early in our career when we first got to Louisville. It was not in a courtroom, but actually it was at our house, believe it or not. So we'd started going to our church in Louisville in the mid-'90s, right after we got there, and we had our third son shortly before this happened. What happened was this was after church, and we noticed this couple coming in the driveway with a big thing of flowers, and I'm going, what in the world's going on here? So our tradition at our church is to deliver flowers from the service to someone in the church for whatever reason, if you're sick or maybe an occasion to celebrate. And so in our case, it was because we just had a baby. And anyway, I met the couple. It was an elderly couple, and their names were Charles and Betty Ann Allen. Well, it turned out Charles Allen was Judge Charles Allen, a federal judge in Louisville, who I didn't know he had any idea who I was. But it just struck me that how amazing that a federal judge and his wife would be delivering flowers to someone, a lowly associate in a law firm, welcoming us to Louisville. They're now deceased, but their legacy lives on for what they taught us about giving of themselves in a spirit of love. And so that's something that we try to implement ourselves in the way we do things and try to do things for others. As important as listening is for a judge, an equally important function is to speak and write appropriately. So the justice system is a two-way process. We as the judges receive input from the litigants as to the facts and the relevant law. Then we respond with questions at oral argument as to the issues that need to be addressed, and ultimately with judgments as to who should prevail in the case and why. Those latter responsibilities are the toughest part of the job because, as you know, this is one job where half of the people you deal with are going to be upset with the way you handle it. Maybe very unusual because in business, generally you want to make everyone happy, but we, by definition, are going to make half of our people unhappy. When I think about the judge's role in declaring the law and applying it to litigants, I'm reminded of the story of Moses. You recall he was the one who gave excuses to God as to why he shouldn't be selected as the leader of the Israelites. Now, my job dwarfs in comparison to the responsibilities of Moses. I do not have to confront a Pharaoh, but my response to being a judge is often analogous to Moses' response to God's charge. Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what to speak." So the lesson I take from this exchange is I can trust God to give me the right words to say and to write for my job. Again, I am deciding cases based on the law and facts, not divine revelation. But I am trying to choose words to be consistent with godly principles. And I will be the first to admit I have not always done that in my career. In particular, I would say that some of my political writings before I went on the bench, in those instances, I sometimes wrote quickly before praying or thinking about the proper Christian response to the issue at hand. The tongue is a small part of the body, James chapter 2, verse 5 reminds us. Yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. Such is the destruction that can be wrought by words. Yet as Proverbs says, on the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found. Now, the confirmation process for a federal judge in the United States Senate is as close to a heavenly day of judgment that anyone will ever have on this earth. Maybe you've seen some of them. I do not wish that experience on anyone. But I tell you, I'm glad for it now, having gone through it, because I believe it was God's way of telling me that I should rely on him more. And it was God's way of telling me to lean on him for more wise choice of words when I communicate. And that's a lesson probably every Christian should learn. Certainly those who use social media, email, and other means of instant and widespread communication through the internet could well heed that lesson. At the confirmation hearing, one of my Christian friends, or college friends, who's a strong Christian, was there, and he prayed with me before my hearing. He was calm, patient, and steadfast in his support for me. And he followed the command found in Scripture, if anyone among you is suffering, let him pray. He was a witness to me that day of the love and power of Christ. I felt the prayers from my family and friends, and to those who prayed for me, and for Bridget, and for all of us, all I can say is thank you. So this July will be the 5th anniversary of the day the United States Senate confirmed my nomination to be a judge in 2017. I have tried to put aside whatever negative things were said about me by those who opposed my judicial confirmation. The senators were just doing their job, and I respect the responsibilities they have in their advice and consent role. As a judge, I am not to hold any grudge. And as a Christian, that responsibility is even greater. I am to uphold the rule of law for all people, regardless of whether they supported or opposed my nomination, and regardless of whether their politics before joining the bench agreed with mine. To uphold the rule of law, judges have the responsibility to write opinions faithful to that law in a way that respects both litigants and colleagues with whom they disagree. That does not mean a judge should shy away from applying a law that may be unpopular among some groups, but it does mean a judge owes the public a fair and reasoned explanation for why the judge reached the decision he or she did. And it means the judge should treat colleagues with respect, even if they disagree as to the outcome of the case. I was reminded a few years of the biblical role of judges by one of our friends who was in Christian fellowship. His name is Mike Juneau. He's a federal judge in Louisiana. Mike reminded me that our job as judges has roots in a passage from Deuteronomy. In chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, there's a reference to Moses' charge to judges at that time. Hear the cases between your brothers and judge righteously between a man and his brother or the alien who is with him. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. Proverbs teaches that the Lord gives wisdom. Through the Lord, we understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. That's from Proverbs. Now, the references I've made to the rule of law bring me to the last point I want to address today, the relationship between law and morality. As a Christian, this issue is obviously important because we have to live our lives consistent with Christian morality. But what are we to do when a law or a court's interpretation of a law conflicts with our Christian beliefs? Well, one answer is provided by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He argued that there are instances in which Christians may be justified to engage in civil disobedience to protest against unjust and immoral laws. Dr. King's view is held by many in the Christian community as an appropriate response. But there is a disagreement as to the legal issues to which Dr. King's approach should be applied. However, as a federal court of appeals judge, I cannot fashion my conduct to disobey any law, and that includes interpretations of the law that have been made by my bosses, the Supreme Court of the United States. I've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and all law consistent with it, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, regardless of whether I agree morally with that law or interpretation. Now, if there ever came a day when I did not believe I could follow the federal judicial oath consistent with my Christian beliefs, I would need to resign from office. But as long as I remain in office, I am to uphold the law consistent with the Constitution and to follow the non-overruled precedents of the Supreme Court. So what is the relationship between law and morality? There are laws that undoubtedly have a moral basis. Laws against murder and testifying falsely, for example, find their roots in the Ten Commandments. But there are other laws that may not be morally based. Conduct that may be constitutional is not necessarily moral. And conduct that is moral may not be constitutionally protected. As a judge, I am to enforce the Constitution as a legal document, not according to what I wish the Constitution said by way of moral guidance. I do believe that there are moral principles in American law, but my job ultimately is to apply the law, not to judge people based on morality. So what is it about being a Christian, or more generally being a religious person, that makes my approach to deciding a case different than someone who doesn't share my religious outlook? Well, I would say one area is with respect to bias. The negative I need to guard against is bringing religious bias to legal questions I am called to decide. But the positive is that because of my understanding of the religious perspective, I believe I'm better positioned to guard against any anti-religious bias that might interpret and apply the laws in ways that infringe upon the free exercise of religion in our country. It can be a difficult job to balance these considerations, but it is one that every judge has to do. We all have biases, religious and non-religious. Judges must be aware of their biases and check them in order to render a fair interpretation of the law. So to summarize, I believe the role of a judge from a Christian perspective is fourfold. First, to approach the job in a prayerful way. Second, to be a good listener. Third, to be wise in communicating. And fourth, to never stop being a Christian on the job, but nonetheless do your job to the best of your abilities according to its secular requirements. Those four things, I believe, are attributes of faith in a judge who is also a Christian. They are also attributes that any Christian should have in the workplace. There are ways in which we can fulfill Christ's teaching that while we are not to be of this world, we are most definitely to live in it. I hope you found these remarks to be helpful, and I'm happy to answer questions. I think Jay has volunteered. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you this evening.
If you want to raise your hand, I will bring the microphone to you.
And I'm happy to talk about anything you'd like to talk about tonight.
PJ.
I'll just ask a question about what you said right there at the end. You said judges must be aware of their biases. So there are two questions. In your experience, do you perceive that most judges are aware of their biases? And do you think that most of those who are aware of their biases try to control that when they're making decisions?
I think it's a very difficult task to make sure you are aware of all your biases going into a case. I think it helps on my court to be with two other judges on the panel. And so if I'm seeing something and I'm bringing something before that I knew before getting into the case that is affecting my judgment, I have a check essentially from the other two judges. Now, if we all have the same bias, we don't have that. But at least having more judges gives me some protection in that regard. And I think you can't always be assured that you're going to leave it all outside the courthouse. But I think that's what we should be striving for.
You wave me to you, and then you wave me away.
Your Honor, may I address the court?
Absolutely.
A lot of the argument among conservatives with judges at all levels is the interpretation of the law and how do you read the law and how do you read the Constitution. And a lot of people think it's a living document and it changes. And a lot of people believe that, to be a strict constitutionalist, that you interpret what our forefathers wrote as the Constitution. And some people want to kind of make law as a judge. And so there's a big debate there. And a lot of us conservatives, want people to just interpret the law as our forefathers wrote it. And I know that's hard to do because that's like interpreting all Scripture. It's oftentimes hard to do, and people disagree on it. So maybe you can just comment on that.
Sure. So you're going to get me talking like I do at the law school about originalism, but as what you're alluding to is the concept of originalism, which is a form of textualism of reading the Constitution according to its original public meaning. And I subscribe to that viewpoint that is the most principled way to interpret the Constitution. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is that we all take an oath to defend the Constitution, and if we don't have a fixed meaning of what it means, or it's going to change over time, how can you really have meaning for that oath if you have a moving target, so to speak, as to what you're agreeing that you're going to uphold? That's one argument. There's also other points of the fact that the document itself has a way to be amended through Article 5, and if you amend the document through interpretation, that really voids the whole meaning of the whole amendment process. But anyway, I could go on and talk for a long time about this. It's a very important point for judges, and we struggle with it because it's not always clear what original meaning is. But it is a way to, I believe, cabin the discretion of judges, because you are forced to think about what is a way to interpret a provision of the Constitution that is consistent with the way the founding generation would have understood it. And it does have some analogies to reading Scripture. I mean, it's essentially a way of looking at the text to understand, through the words, what was intended to be conveyed through those words at the time they were conveyed. So it's a difficult task, but I think that's the best way to cabin judicial activism, I think you referred to, by our being consistent with the way the framing, the founders intended the document to mean. Yes?
Sorry, I'm going to ask a question, my friend.
Uh-oh.
So our political discourse has not been great over the last 3 or 4 years, probably longer than that. Are there things that you do in the court, practices, relationships? Because you obviously come from different political positions as well, and you have to decide cases together. Are there things that you do within the court structure yourself that help have better conversations across different political convictions that could be something that would be useful for the larger community?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there are more non-substantive ways that we come together, and then there are substantive ways. What I mean by that is, as far as just our general collegiality of our court is promoted through, we try to leave disagreements, in the conference room, so to speak, when we're deciding a case. If we may disagree on the way a case should be decided, but we're not going to continue that, to have animosity towards our colleagues once a decision has been made. You may file a dissent, you may disagree with the way the majority came out, but it's not going to continue and be a personal thing beyond that decision that we make in our conference after the argument. So that's maybe a non-substantive answer, but a more substantive answer is, ultimately, I mean, there's a notion of rule of law. So rule of law is different than politics, and there is a huge struggle over that concept, and many people say there is no distinction between rule of law and politics. I still believe there is a distinction, and so to the extent you can plead or look to neutral principles to try to decide cases, and do it through logic and through references that people can understand where you're coming from in your reasoning, you can persuade colleagues to change their minds in a reasoned fashion to try to bring consensus as to what the decision should be. It doesn't always happen, but it does happen. And I think in our judicial, the way we decide things in the judiciary is we are still listening to each other and trying to persuade each other, even in a case where you might think the judges are completely different perspectives. But one statistic that people are always shocked to learn is that, the large majority of our cases, the judges at my level, the 3 judges, we will agree on the outcome. It's probably maybe 5% of the cases, 10%, where we don't agree. So there's a vast amount of case law out there where everyone is agreement as to what the rule of law is. It's just the small number that we have disagreements that people glom onto and the news will glom onto to say that it's just politics, when that's not really the case. Anyway, long-winded answer. There you go.
We have a lot of students here who are criminal justice majors, poli-sci majors, business majors, other majors, a large percentage of which are probably going to go to law school. And one of the frequent questions that we get runs along the theme of how can a lawyer defend somebody who he believes to be guilty? And it sort of runs in line with what you were saying about we take an oath to uphold that Constitution and to uphold the law, but we're Christians, and so we have to balance that. Could you give our students some of your wisdom and some of your advice about how they can do that as they pursue a legal journey?
Well, the reason we have our courts and the system is to ferret out the truth at the end of the day. And so I think sometimes you may think you know what the right answer is in a case. And I'm saying maybe the guilt or innocence. I mean, but it could apply in that context as well. You go into a case, you learn a little bit about it, and you think you know what the right answer is. But the more you dig into it, you realize there's something else about it that you missed. So the virtue of our system is that we make sure you've gone through the paces of analysis and the law that applies before you reach judgment. And so I guess that would be my advice, that you may think you're defending someone who's guilty, but at the end of the day, it may turn out that the person's not guilty. So that's one way of looking at it. And another way of looking at it is, even if the person is guilty, it's important to uphold our system and our principles so that the person who is innocent that you haven't destroyed whatever that principle is that protects the innocent as well as the guilty. So you have that to as a litigator or a lawyer to defend as well. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, it can be difficult in certain cases to represent individuals, but our greatest tradition of our legal system is our lawyers who have defended individuals who are not popular. And I mean, heaven forbid if any of us were ever in that position of being the one to be wrongly accused. I mean, wouldn't you want to have someone to stand up for you in that situation? So anyway, that's another long-winded answer. But I do think it's important that we uphold the system, and so that the innocent person can be vindicated if that day comes, that you need that system in place.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So my question is sort of a little bit along the same lines. You mentioned that sometimes there can be a little bit of a rift between what is constitutional and what's, moral or even biblical. So I guess my question is, how have you handled cases where you had to make a decision that was constitutional, but it just didn't spiritually or emotionally sit right with you, and it just stuck with you? How have you handled cases where you had to make a decision that was the legal one, but didn't feel right?
Well, ultimately, you have to decide based on the law of what it says. I do think that there is a role for, if you believe that there is a law that has been wrongly interpreted, either by your court or the Supreme Court, I think there is a role there to be able to point that out, perhaps as a concurrence. I've had situations where I've written concurrences where I think the Supreme Court should maybe reconsider something, and I would write a concurrence. I'm not saying that necessarily. It's not because I believe it's immoral. It's just that I think the law has gotten it wrong, or the judges have gotten it wrong in interpreting the law, and that can be informed. I think the law can be, law has certain laws have roots in moral questions, but ultimately it's the question of whether or not the case law is in keeping with the way the law, what the law is. So I guess, again, my answer would be that you can point those things out, but ultimately you have to apply the law that the courts have interpreted that are binding on you.
How often do you see appeals that go to even to the Supreme Court?
From our court that go on to the Supreme Court? Not that often. Most of the cases end at our court at the level of the Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court hears, if they hear 100 cases in a year, that's a lot of cases in 1 year, and we're hearing thousands of cases. So on our court, we have 16 judges that are active judges. So by active, I mean a judge we hear cases in a panel of 3, but then you can petition, if you're the losing party, for an en banc review, which would be all 16 of our judges. It can be quite an intimidating court when you have 16 judges who are hearing your case. But generally, we're the end of the line for most appeals. Sure.
So we have a president, we have the U.S. Congress, and we have the judicial branch. So we have three
Right.
judicial branches, or 3 different branches of government. A lot of times in the last few years, you see a lot of executive orders coming out of the president's office, which may be constitutional, maybe not. A lot of them probably need to be interpreted. And then you have the Congress that has responsibility of maybe changing a law or adding new law. And oftentimes it gets mixed up a little bit there between the executive branch and the legislative branch and what each row of each one has. And then it ends up a lot of times on your all's bench, and a lot of times you all probably don't want it to end up on your bench, maybe even a controversial outcome of a presidential election, for example. You know, judges probably don't want to decide who's going to be the president of the United States because there's a conflict in the closeness of the election or so forth. So what would you advise future members of Congress that might be in this room or future judges, or maybe, you know, you never know, you might have a president here. What advice would you give them in that respect to say, look, this is, you know, when you make the law, somebody's got to interpret it, but whose role is it, and how would you handle that?
Well, I would say one thing that we all need more of is study of our history and our government. And from what I've seen of the students, talking to students here in political science, you all have a good grounding in that here. But that is not something that's common throughout America. There's civics education is just abysmal in our country today. And I think that is a root of a lot of our problems, because as individuals grow up and they get involved in political things or other things in life, I don't think there's a clear understanding of what the respective role of the branches of government are and how they interact with each other. And so it creates a situation where when a judge rules, you think it's a political decision, when it is oftentimes in these separation of powers cases, it's based upon an understanding of what each branch of government is to be doing. And so I think just the preparation for that, if you're going to law school, have a deep understanding of history and the role of government, and draw upon that, because I think it's just lacking, and the law school curriculum doesn't really deal with that as much. It's more, it gets into a jurisprudence which may or may not be consistent with the way the structure of government is set up in our Constitution. But we've kind of gone down different paths, and certainly you have to honor precedent, But if you are in a position to make it align more with separation of powers, that's something that can be considered and something that you can prepare for through, I think, just through good civics education. Sure.
So when you're making decisions, of course, you're looking primarily at the case, law, precedent, et cetera. Are there ever instances where it is appropriate to look at other sources? I'm thinking, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, perhaps even Scripture. I mean, have there been cases where that did seem appropriate to pull on something from the tradition from which upon which our legal system rests?
That is, I think there's certainly quotations of sources, other sources in case law, and I've done some citations of other sources as well. I can't say that it's ever been the deciding factor in a case. It's more to illustrate an underlying principle that's in the positive law that you're applying. But I mean, there's such roots and all concepts of law. It seems like you can dig back in the history and you will find analogs or something that led to where you are today. And sometimes that, as I think through it, sometimes I think that could help you in explaining how you came up with an answer in a case. But ultimately, it's going to be based upon the positive law that you're applying, not on Cicero or the classics. But those principles are often there. I mean, you go back to Roman law and you can see the roots of principles we have in our law today.
Well, JB, let's thank our speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.